Okay, so let me just cue up my screen. This is another video to help you go over the taxing multiplier. Part of this handout, the taxing multiplier, I feel like is the thing that students kind of struggle with. They do okay with spending multiplier, and then for some reason they get the taxing multiplier and they sort of freak out. But I'm here to tell you, don't freak out. It's pretty easy. So first of all, the change in GDP formula is going to be absolutely the same as what we did before with the spending multiplier, except instead of the spending multiplier, you're going to put the tax multiplier in. And then you're going to multiply by the change in taxing. And my only real specific thing I want to get into here is you really have to pay close attention to the sign of the taxing. So for example, if there's a tax cut, you have to make sure you put a negative symbol in front of whatever the tax cut is. So if the tax cut was $20 million, then you need to do a negative 20. If it's an increase in taxes, then you're just going to leave it a positive number. So the sign is really important to the tax cut, as is the sign to the tax multiplier. So let's just explain how you figure that out. So first of all, the MPS is in the denominator of both of these formulas. So the tax multiplier is a negative symbol MPC divided by the MPS. Or if that's too tough to remember because you get stressed out about what goes in the numerator, what goes in the denominator, it's a negative symbol. Just remember that the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier add up to 1. So for example, if your spending multiplier, if you think about what we just did with spending multipliers was 10, then that means your tax multiplier is a negative 9, and that means that they add up to 1. So the tax multiplier, if you think about the formula over here, and then the fact that adding it plus a positive number is going to be 1, it's always going to have a negative symbol in front of it. So again, the sign is really important to both of these aspects of the tax multiplier. And this, I think, is the thing that might lead some students to an incorrect answer. But if you keep it in mind, I think you'll be okay. So we only did 2 examples because I think if you're doing proficient with the spending multiplier, then the taxing multiplier will come naturally as well. The nation's MPC is 0.9. So what I encourage students to do is to pick the method that's more comfortable for you. I would say if you're really proficient at determining the spending multiplier, then just figure that out and then figure out what negative number matches with it to make it equal to 1. Or you could do the MPS over the MPC rather over the MPS. I think for my purposes, when I learned how to do this, it was easier just to memorize one formula. But now that I've done this many times, I'm more comfortable with knowing both. But again, you have to pick what works for you. So if the MPC is 0.9, that would be a negative 0.9 divided by a 0.1. And of course, that's going to come out to be negative 9. Or if we solve for the spending formula, the spending multiplier, it would be 10 plus a negative 9 equals 1. So either way, negative 9 is going to be the tax multiplier. What's going to happen? What's the maximum change in GDP? So we're going to solve for the change in GDP, and it's going to equal the tax multiplier, which is a negative 9, if the government increases taxes by 5 million. So that's going to be times a positive 5. Think about this logically. If the government increases taxes, then that means both businesses and people, consumers, have less money to spend. So therefore, it's pretty logical that the GDP is going to fall. And that's why there's a negative number. So the negative number is going to symbol GDP decreasing, and a positive number is going to symbolize it increasing. So if this were to occur, then the economy would lose a potential of $45 million worth of GDP. So that's your answer to number 1. If we slide over to number 2, if a nation's marginal propensity to consume is marginal propensity to save is 0.2, then that means the spending multiplier is going to be 5 because 1 over 0.2 is the 1 over 2/10 multiplied by the reciprocal. It's 5. Therefore, the tax multiplier is going to be equal to negative 4 if we think about they plus each other equals 1. So what's going to be the change in real GDP if the government cuts taxes by $11 million? So again, think of your sign. If it's a cut, you've got to put a negative number in there. So the change in GDP is going to be equal to a -4 times a -11. That, right? No. Yeah. Sorry. I just kind of lost track for a second. So -4 times a -11 equals a positive $44 million. And that's going to be the change in GDP. Again, think about it logically. If the government cuts taxes, this gives people and businesses more money to spend. Therefore, the GDP is going to increase. So those would be your answers for number one and 2. If we move down a little bit lower, we're getting into a concept that the College Board loves to ask, and it's about the fact that government spending has more of an impact on the change in GDP. So in this scenario, we have a recession with $100 billion below full employment output. So theoretically, we want the government to do something to get the economy to improve its GDP by $100 billion. So it says, assume that the government increases spending by $20 billion to stimulate the economy. Assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. Calculate the maximum potential change that could result from the government spending. So this is just kind of doing what we did before. 1 over 0.2. How did I get that? Because the MPC is 0.8. They add up to 1. That's going to come out to be 1 over 2/10. The multiplier is going to be 5. So the change in GDP that's going to happen from this is 5 times the change in spending, which is $20 billion. And therefore, theoretically, if everybody spends their money the way that the marginal propensity to consume in this economy says, this should close the gap. Now, what if somebody said, hey, listen, instead of doing government spending, what if we just cut taxes and gave households and businesses that disposable income and then they could spend it? So this is where you get into like political philosophies and ideology about how to handle a recession. Do you government spend, and this is going to provide sources of employment for people? They're going to earn money and they're going to spend it. Or are you going to cut the taxes of people who are working and hope that they spend their money? So that's a big hope, because you have all these people who are unemployed in a recession and you're not really doing anything to help their household earn more income. So you're only depending on the households that have an income and you're hoping that they spend the money. If they lower personal income taxes by $20 billion instead of increasing spending, conventional wisdom says that this should change the GDP by just as much. But economists know that that's not going to happen. And it really has to do with the fact, because in this economy, people save almost 20% of their income. So there's 2 ways to answer this question. And first of all, the theoretical answer is that in this economy, according to the data given in the question, people save 20% of their income. So if you cut my taxes and I earn $100 more a week, I'm only going to spend $80 of it. Whereas if the government just spent $100 on growing the economy through, for example, hiring an engineering firm to design a bridge, 100% of that $100 is being spent right there in that initial transaction. So what's going to happen is it says, would the maximum total change in real GDP be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the one that you calculated in Part A? The GDP will not grow, and it will be smaller than what we calculated here in Part A, because here's one way to answer it. Due to people's, and I'm abbreviating and writing this quick just so you understand, on a real test or exam, you're going to write this in an articulate, thorough way. Due to people's marginal propensity to save, only 80% of their new found disposable income will be spent. So that's the theoretical answer. You know, you're using words and you're articulating why, but I actually want to show you mathematically how you can prove that as well. Remember, we have the tax multiplier. So if we cut taxes by $20 billion, what would be the change in GDP? Well, the spending multiplier we figured out was 5. So therefore, the tax multiplier is going to be a -4. And if we're going to cut taxes, we lower the taxes, we're going to multiply this by a -20 billion. -4 times -20 equals a gain of $80 billion in the GDP. So if we cut taxes alone, we can mathematically prove that it would only have a maximum impact of $80 billion upon the GDP, whereas government spending alone would change it by $100 billion. So this is the mathematical answer, and this is the theoretical answer. I don't think either one of them by themselves is good enough. You have to connect these two answers in one articulate response, because you're going to get a 5 on the AP exam, and you get a 5 by having all of the things. You get a 5 by explaining that a government a government tax cut would only yield $80 billion worth of growth because people will save part of their income. According to the data in this question, they're going to save 20% of their income. And therefore, a tax cut is only going to have 80% of the impact that a government spending alone would have. In some questions we'll do in the future, we see government spending and tax cuts happening simultaneously. And that's sort of extending this a little further. But this is where we are right now. And, if that was tough, which it is for many people the first time we do this, head back and listen to it again, and follow up in class if you've got more. All right, we're all done here.